The first thing you want to do is start a new game and select Lunatic Plus or Lunatic depending on what you're trying to do here. All of the strategies I discuss in these guides are intended to work for Lunatic Plus, but as a result they work even more consistently on Lunatic, so it should be fine. For Robin, you usually want negative luck as your flaw. It's easily the best or worst, I don't know how to phrase it. Just get rid of luck. There are so many ways to lower enemy crit rates and so many ways to raise your own crit rate, this stat is almost insignificant. For your positive stat, there's a few considerations. If you want a more consistent early game and good long-term Robin, pick plus defense. If you want a slightly more difficult early game, but a more optimized endgame Robin, pick plus speed. If you have other opinions, just, I don't know, look it up on Google or GameFAQs or YouTube. There's probably people making arguments for why every single Robin is better than every other Robin. I value early game consistency more because it's the hardest section of the game by far, and being optimized at endgame for a few extra points of speed isn't really anything you're going to need. I'm going to make a complete guide for Robin and all of the other early game characters, but for now, I want to keep this information brief and focus on the chapter-specific strategies. Oh, and by the way, male or female Robin are both useful in different contexts, so just pick whichever one you prefer. I recommend going into the settings and turning your combat animations off, and turning the game speed to fast while you're still in the premonitions chapter. This makes it so that you don't have to keep changing the settings every time you reload the game in chapter 0. Now, let's get right into the prologue. The first thing you need to do is defeat all of the enemies rushing your group as quickly as possible so you don't get overwhelmed. After you accomplish that, you'll be free to tackle the rest of the map however you prefer and take things slowly. This is a very common theme in Lunatic and Lunatic Plus gameplay, and once you understand this, it becomes much easier to handle these maps. I think there's a reason they try to teach you this immediately on the very first battle. Start by having Frederick run up and attack this Myrmidon with the Silver Lance. There will be a small chance to miss, and the chance to miss is higher if the enemy gets Evade plus 10 as his skill, but there's really nothing you can do about this. It's the first chapter of the game, and you have no prep screen, and you don't have any tools to help mitigate enemy RNG. However, this attack is pretty consistent. Generally speaking, if you need to take a risky action, the best time to do it will be on the very first attack of turn 1. If this attack lands, it makes the rest of the map significantly easier, and if it misses, you just reset. This only wastes around 10 to 20 seconds per attempt, and it's much better than playing slowly and passively and waiting 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, or even longer before eventually running into a dead end. It's better to take the risks right away. Understanding how to make resetting faster will drastically reduce the time needed to clear maps. Then you'll get into the more consistent late game, where resetting is almost never needed. Next, have Robin move to this position below Chrom and give the bronze sword to Chrom. You won't be needing it right away, but Frederick will. Have Chrom move over to Frederick. Here we're going to use a trade manipulation pair-up strategy. This is one of my favorite strategies, so I love showcasing it. Have Chrom trade with Frederick and give him the bronze sword while moving it to the first slot of his inventory. This will cause Frederick to equip the bronze sword so that he can use it during the upcoming enemy phase. Let's also give him the vulnerary, since he's the most likely character to need it. And now have Chrom pair up with Frederick. This will keep Chrom safe while also increasing Frederick's stats for better combat against the incoming enemies. You were able to take advantage of the high attack power of the Silver Lance, but also switch to a different weapon and conserve Silver Lance charges. Not bad, right? Additionally, if Chrom manages to land a dual strike right here, you can defeat the second Myrmidon. It's not mandatory, but it does help. Have Lisa move in front of Robin and end the turn. There's a safe spot right here. Surviving this enemy phase is extremely consistent. I'm not sure if there's any way these enemies could ever kill Frederick with this starting set of moves. However, there is still a lot of variance in what comes next. The number of enemies alive and the remaining HP will depend on Chrom's dual striking luck, and the enemy configuration and skills will also influence what you need to do on turn 2 to maximize your chance of survival. Additionally, the incoming Dark Mage can be very dangerous depending on his skill set. The worst case scenario is where you get a Dark Mage with something like Vantage Plus and Luna Plus. This makes it so that he'll deal a lot of damage and you can't ever attack him without getting hit. If you get a Dark Mage like that, you really need to clean up the other enemies fast. Generally speaking, what you'd like to do is bait out the enemies in a way where Frederick can finish off the remaining melee attackers while staying out of range of the Dark Mage. If you're injured, you can use your vulnerary here. For the highest consistency, you want to leave Frederick in range of all 3 enemies, and this means Lisa usually can't reach him. You want to do this so that you don't have too many threats left to deal with on turn 3. Regarding Robin and Lisa will normally have to move into this corner spot, which is always safe. Robin is a little bit more tricky, so let's get into it because this is going to be a whole discussion. If they stand in range of just one enemy, that enemy will prefer to attack Robin instead of attacking Frederick. This is a tactic I call anchoring, and we'll use it a lot in future chapters. However, it's not mandatory inventory here, it's basically just optional. There is a lot of variance to what you can do depending on the exact enemies, their skills, positions, but I'll give a brief outline of all of the lines of play that I consider to be valid. If Robin can get into a position where they can fight and kill one enemy, it can often be worth doing something like this. If they can stand next to Frederick and transfer over Chrom, this is even better. Frederick probably doesn't need Chrom anymore to finish off these enemies, although you can double check just in case. Don't make any misplays on Lunatic Plus, it usually leads to an instant game over. On the other hand, gaining support points with Chrom will help Robin a bit in this turn and in the future. You can also have them grab Chrom and drop him in a place where he's guaranteed to survive. Then on the following turn, you'll have 3 actions available instead of only 2 actions available because none of your units were paired up on turn 2. Lastly, I want to make a note of something. While doing this turn 2 positioning, you can choose to keep Chrom in a position to fight and gain experience instead of Robin. You do this by transferring over Chrom, moving him into the lead, and then keeping or dropping Robin. There are a few reasons why I really favor doing this, and it doesn't really come up until a few chapters from now, but I have to mention it now because your Chapter 0 prep can make Chapter 1 way more consistent, and your Chapter 0 to 1 prep can make Chapter 2 way more consistent. Lunatic and Lunatic Plus have so much micro and macro strategy, and this is one great example because it pays off almost right away. If Frederick and Chrom gain enough points of strength between them, they have a guaranteed range to one-shot enemies in Chapter 2. In order to accomplish this, I really prefer helping Chrom and Frederick get as much experience as possible in Chapter 0 and Chapter 1. I know some people favor feeding Robin early on, especially using the water trick, but I actually never use the water trick in any of my runs anymore, and the thing about Robin is that they're already extremely strong, they already gain experience extremely fast, and they'll often be over-leveled before you get to the point where you want to seal them anyway. As a result, this valuable Chapter 0 experience is actually much better to give to Chrom because he levels up slowly and he has a harder time leveling up. Giving him the experience now while you can, and where the impact will be massive on your Chapter 2 consistency. And then Robin can just easily pick up experience anywhere they need to later on. And of course, you can also just have Frederick stand here and fight all 3 enemies by himself. That's perfectly fine too. But I've blabbed on for long enough. Let's just move on to the next turn. Ideally, by turn 3, you've already either won or lost the map, at least in terms of RNG-based outcomes. All of the approaching melee enemies should be dealt with, and now you just have to be careful while cleaning up this last Dark Mage. You may want to check their stats and see how dangerous they are. In some cases, you're going to want to one-shot them with the Silver Lance to prevent any problems, depending on which skills they have. And don't forget, you can use Lisa to heal Frederick to full before he attacks, in the case of Vantage Plus. If you get a weaker Dark Mage, or you want to play a little bit more risky, you can always try to have Chrom set up the kill and get the experience. This is a good time to mention something. If Chrom or even Frederick gets a really bad level up, it honestly might be worth resetting. It's genuinely worth considering. I never do this later in the run, but at this point, you're 2 minutes into the game. If your Chrom gets completely screwed over, this is going to have drastic consequences moving forward, and it can make the upcoming difficult chapters even more difficult. I would say it's worth my time personally to reset and replay the first 2 minutes of the run over until I get a decent Chrom, especially if he gets strength. He's worth keeping. The alternative is to spend an hour or more before running into a dead end in Chapter 2 and having to restart the entire run's progress over. For the record, Chrom's most important stat is absolutely strength. Frederick likes HP, strength, speed, defense. Skill is also a good stat on both characters because it boosts dual strike rate and accuracy. Now, with the first part of the map handled, you can move on to the second phase. This group of enemies up top can vary in difficulty depending on which skills they end up rolling. However, it's usually possible to come up with a 100% consistent way of clearing them. You just have to examine each enemy and figure out which ones are the most dangerous, and using a strategy where you clear the dangerous enemies as fast as possible while leaving the weaker enemies alive for Chrom or Robin to clean up later. You really only get a game over in the second half of the map if you make a misplay, or maybe if you get the worst possible luck. Don't be afraid to use Frederick here. If he levels up, it makes Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 way more consistent. By the way, take as much time as you need to level up, prepare, and get into the best position. Also, this shiny spot on the ground, let's go ahead and talk about it. Now, personally, I say you should use them. The game was designed with the intention that you're going to use them, so just use it. Have Frederick stand here without any pair-up partner. If he gets free experience from this tile, it's worth a lot to him. Because experience gain on promoted units is slower, it's worth more to him than anyone else. If you pick up a useful item, it can influence the early game and open up other strategies. However, you'd be surprised at how often the randomness of these shiny tiles doesn't really change what you're capable of doing. It just changes the resource management game slightly and leads to more dynamic gameplay. I'm going to talk about this more later on when I get to Prologue 1. Because this top section can have a lot of variance already, I'm going to show 2 different attempts and how I cleared the map on each of those attempts, so you can see how things might play out differently. While I do that, I think this is a good time to talk about how to play around enemy skills and enemy skill combinations. Vantage Plus allows an enemy to attack you first on player phase, and Pass allows an enemy to walk through your units. Vantage Pass combination is one of the better enemy configurations to see. Pass can be annoying at times, but most of the time you can actually use it to your advantage to separate enemies, which I am going to show in future chapters. Vantage by itself isn't a huge problem. On a melee unit, you can just attack them from range, and in the case of someone like Frederick, he can usually just let the enemy hit him and barely take any damage anyway. Enemies in Lunatic Plus have the same stats as Lunatic enemies, which means a lot of them will just not damage Frederick at all. Additionally, you can play around Vantage by fighting on enemy phase. Keep that in mind. Hawkeye is typically one of the least impactful enemy skills. All it does is remove variance from the game. Now, it can be dangerous if combined with a powerful offensive skill or a high damage output unit. You really hate to see this on an enemy with an effective weapon or on a dark mage, but a lot of the times this just guarantees that the enemy will hit Frederick for 0 damage, or it's going to hit one of your other units that they were 80 to 90% likely to hit anyway. Now, Lonku in particular hates to see Hawkeye, but most of your other units really won't care. Enemy mages, especially in the early game, can often be one-shot with something like the Silver Lance. If they have dangerous skills but don't have Vantage, you can just run up and attack them before they can do anything. Then, if possible, use a trade manipulation strategy, like the one we used at the start of the chapter, to get Frederick back to a less valuable weapon. If enemy mages and dark mages have Vantage, it can be a good idea to fight them on enemy phase. This also plays around enemies with Nosferatu, but we'll have to talk about that later around chapter 6. Luna is one of the most scary enemy skills, but it's not as bad as you might think. Unless a bunch of enemies all have Luna and they all have like guaranteed hit rates, this essentially just means that enemies can deal a little bit of damage to Frederick instead of dealing like no damage to Frederick as they do on Lunatic mode, where he tanks everything no problem. When they attack your other units, there's very rare situations where it causes them to one-shot characters like Sumia instead of leaving her alive, but most of the time it actually doesn't change the outcomes. Because your other unit's defense is low anyway, cutting it in half doesn't really change the numbers all that much. It just makes the enemy deal a few extra points of damage, and they'll either still leave your unit on low health, which they were going to do anyway, or they'll one-shot your unit, which they were going to do anyway. By the way, if you have an idea about who you want to pair up with Frederick on chapter 2, you should start building support with them now for better dual strikes later. I typically use Chrom, but it should be possible to do a Frederick Robin support early on, and use Robin more than Chrom instead. Just remember, it's very easy for Robin to catch back up in experience later on, and it's more difficult for Chrom to do that. Also, check this out. You can play around Pass by standing at the edge of an enemy attack range. If they have no valid spots to stand, it doesn't matter that they can move through your units. Lastly, let's talk about the boss. This is one of those cases where the game can look very RNG dependent at a glance. However, as your game knowledge increases, you will realize this is not RNG dependent at all. It is deterministic, and it's testing your knowledge of the advanced game mechanics, particularly support units. Support units are so good in Lunatic Plus, way better than every other lower difficulty mode. The reason is because on lower game modes, even on Lunatic to an extent, enemies are weak enough that you can simply roll over them with your best player phase attackers and enemy phase sweepers. But in Lunatic Plus, this is less true. The enemies are dangerous enough that you actually need the best support units and support tactics to keep your lead units alive and to overcome these dangerous enemies. So let's look at this example. None of my units are capable of fighting the boss safely without taking on a crit chance. Do you really want to risk a low % crit at the end of a chapter and then be forced to reset and lose 5 or 10 minutes of your time, or even longer? Because if you use water walking strategy, which is really tedious and takes forever, it will take even longer. Obviously, you don't want to do that. This problem is also going to come up again in the future chapters, and the game is trying really hard to teach you how to play around it right now so you have the knowledge for it later. First, give your other vulnerary to Robin. They might want it in the next chapter, and you're not going to have a prep screen before then. Secondly, make sure Robin is on full health, and I mean full. Last, have Frederick check the last remaining shiny spot for the same reason we mentioned earlier. Now, Robin is your one unit who is capable of attacking at 2 range. We're going to use this to our advantage, even though the boss can also attack at 2 range. In fact, it's because the boss can attack at 2 range that we actually can and need to do things this way. If they're standing in this position, they can chip the enemy, but the boss has a low % chance to crit them. Check the combat forecast. Now let's try something. Move Frederick here to the spot beside where Robin will stand. Now move Lisa here to the spot below where Robin will stand. Now pair up Chrom with Robin. Checking the combat forecast again, the crit chance is now gone. See, in Awakening, every character who is adjacent to you, even if you don't have support ranks yet, gives a small boost to your overall support bonus. And it just so happens with 3 points of support from these 3 units, you get a reduced enemy crit chance. This will allow Robin to fight the boss with 0 risk. There is no chance to die here if you know what you're doing. Even if the boss has Hawkeye and Luna Plus, you will always survive. Having said that, I believe my plus defense Robin was able to survive against the Luna Hawkeye combination with exactly 1 HP. So if you're using a plus speed Robin, you might want to reset and make sure that the boss doesn't have Luna. This is one example of the plus speed Robin being less consistent in the early game. After the first combat with the boss, you can step away, have Lisa heal you to full over 2 turns, and then get ready for another round of combat. The boss doesn't heal, so you can take it slow. If you want Chrom to get the experience, make sure you check your maximum possible damage output, including dual strikes. You might want to have Chrom unequip his weapons and then switch Robin back into the lead in order to stop Chrom from dual striking and accidentally killing the opponent. This allows Robin to leave the boss on low health as long as you're good with your math and your planning. Once the boss is weak enough, you can use Chrom with the rapier for maximum accuracy. You don't need all of these rapier charges in the early game, so feel free to use them for stuff like this. A Frederick pair-up can also give Chrom a few extra points of damage if he needs just a little bit more strength. Now, let's be bold. Make sure to have Robin and Lisa move forward so they're actually standing next to Chrom when he attacks. It might look scary, but if you know what you're doing, you've already won the map anyway. This boss will never get to attack again before Chrom kills him, and every little bit of support bonus is going to help in the future chapters. We've already seen how it can be used to mitigate enemy crit chance, and when you get a C support, it's even easier to counteract enemy dodge, crit, and accuracy. Support ranks and bonuses are one of your most valuable and underrated tools in Lunatic Plus. Imagine if you could go to the casino and play roulette while increasing your chance to win by 5% on each spin. You're not going to win every turn of the wheel, but that's not the point. That's not what I'm saying. After spinning the wheel 100 times, you'll come back with way more chips in total, and it's the exact same logic here. You're going to fight 50, 100, 200 combats from now until the end of the game. Giving yourself slightly better RNG in every combat will lead to more favorable board states in the future, and it really reduces the pressure of the enemy units who are trying to overwhelm your team. It will allow you to clear maps in fewer attempts and fewer resets, which saves you time. Anyway, that's all I have to say about this. Look forward to the next one. There is an alternate strategy where you have Chrom and Robin abuse their ability to walk on water, and this allows you to feed a lot of experience and kills to Robin in the very first chapter. However, for the reasons I discussed above, I prefer to give the experience to Chrom and Frederick anyway, and my method is a lot faster and more fun. It allows you to start your run with less tedious turn-ending simulations. Lastly, these enemies sometimes actually have a crit chance on Robin, especially the mage that can target you from range, so if you waste a bunch of time setting up water walking strats and then die to a crit, you just end up wasting even more time trying to use an already slow strategy. To me, it's just not worth. If you want to do water walking, you can search YouTube for Lunatic Awakening Water Walking Prologue or something like that. You'll find a video that shows you how to do it. But for now, enjoy the rest of your day.